really. This is Ken.
I apologize for being
No
late. I'm
problem.
so sorry.
Yeah. No problem. Tomorrow we are good at waiting. Yeah.
Crosstown traffic.
Yeah. That's
Just absolutely brutal. I hoped to be here much earlier, but Christmas at Rockefeller's, trying to cross from Rockefeller Center is nearly impossible. Thank you so much.
She's my translator.
Hello.
Nice
Nice to meet you.
And this is Lane, my colleague.
Hi, how are you? You want to get in here?
And do you have a preference of sitting arrangements or whatever's easier for you guys?
Anywhere
Yeah.
is comfortable.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to be recording if that's okay.
Maybe
Sure.
Okay.
one, two.
Would you like anything to drink, by the way?
Black coffee would be great. Thank you much.
Oh, can we get your autograph?
Sure. I'm honored.
Yeah. This is his Korean version.
Ah, okay, great.
Eat the crowd.
Lynn, could you just get the door? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Okay.
Well, what do we have here?
네. 늦어서 고맙다.
그거.
너무 어렵나?
Have you ever read Thanks for Being Late? The book?
No.
Thank you for being late. 예. 토마스 프리드만?
No, I've seen and heard of the book, but I've never read it. No.
It's a story about someone being late, so that the person who was waiting have chance to like think and relax and.
I
just
relaxed
have-
once, but I don't ever want to do that again.
Okay.
Relaxing's overrated.
Yeah. Okay.
이게 얼마 시간인 거니?
How long do we have? How much?
Whatever you need.
Okay.
One hour?
Yeah, it's easy.
Okay.
Again, I apologize for being late, and I actually have time on the back end before my next, so I'm just fine.
You don't have to. You don't have to apologize.
We have a lot of time for you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. So let's start.
sure.
Okay,
And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to see you in Seoul on that last trip, but
Yeah,
there
right,
was that
right, right.
storm.
Yeah. Right.
And
yeah.
I couldn't go there unless the planes would go there.
좀
I seem to have lots of transportation problems.
플라이트 캔슬돼가지고 우리 다시 만나는 거예요. 오케이. 질문을 바로 들어가겠다고.
So can we move on to the question?
Sure.
Okay. The first question, what are your thoughts on the recent concern about the global economy? You have established a reputation for...
I can read all of them.
Okay.
Okay.
They taught me to read when I was younger.
You're going to ask about the next year's economy.
Yeah, so basically for a variety of reasons, I think things are going to be better than people think they'll be. I think there's too much fear and too much misplaced concern. I do think that the central banks of the world are crazy. Bank of Korea is crazy. I mean, the most recent interest rate hike in the Bank of Korea did is ridiculous when you actually look at the features in Korea specifically and compare them to other countries in the world. We can come back and talk about that, but I do think the central banks are too prone right now to be flattening the yield curve, which is what the Bank of Korea did. This is what we're doing in America. And they don't think about how that can go wrong on them. So, for example, if you look just recently in America, where long-term interest rates have come down, fairly markedly in the last month or so. That is something they can't control. And so when they raise short rates, but they can't control long rates come down, you flatten the yield curve even more in my way of thinking of the world, the yield curve is one of the most important features because it impacts future bank lending. And steeper yield curves are always better than flatter yield curves. I've said too much.
No, he understands English.
I know he does, but I was told that he wants you to translate. So if you're to translate, that's me doing a lot of talking.
No, we're good. He'll just ask me some of the parts that he didn't understand.
Yeah. Oh, I see. So you're not going to actually translate directly. You're only going to answer questions of his. Oh,
yes,
great.
Yes.
Oh, that's easier.
Yes, he's really good
I
at
assume.
English.
No, I assume you're really good at English. You went to school in Korea, so you should be good at English.
I'm not that good, but I understand almost.
So there's a number of positive features, and most people have. There's two things that I say over and over again, and one of them is that fear of something that is not actually bad is bullish, because the fear's in the marketplace now, and when it turns out to not be bad, the fear has to revert to the normal. So fear. So the way I always say that in American English is fear of a false factor is always bullish. But also big fear of a little bad thing is bullish for the same reason. If the fear's big and the bad thing is only little but not big, then the spread is what will move the market in the future. And right now I think in so many things that you can see that have people concerned, there's either fear of a false factor or big fear of a little negative. And therefore I think things will be better next year. I reiterate what I started to say before, which is that I think in so many central banks, the central bankers are crazy. But one of my biases is to think that central bankers are crazy. I almost always think central bankers are crazy. William McChesney Martin was the longest running head of the U.S. Central Bank ever, and said that when you become the head of the U.S. Fed, you take a little pill and it makes you forget everything you ever knew, and the pill lasts as long as you're the head of the U.S. Central Bank. And my general interpretation, followed his successor, was Arthur Burns, who was the best prepared person up to that point in time in history ever to be head of the Fed, and he was a terrible head of the Fed. And afterwards they asked Burns why he did all these things that he said he'd never ever do, and he said, because I took Martin's pill. And I think they all take Martin's pill, and my suspicion is they always will. They can't keep themselves from doing these things there's no reason to do, as if they were little crazy kids at an amusement park driving a bumper car. But you know, if you look at America right now, just a framework that we could actually extend to South Korea. The broad quantity of money is growing at 3%. The economy is growing at 3%. We have 2% inflation. And so nominal GDP is growing at 5%. If nominal GDP is growing at 5% and quantity of money growth at 3%, you're either going to shrink the growth of the economy or you're going to get deflation. And since 2% was always what the central bank wanted for its inflation target, I don't know why it wants to run what's currently a tight money policy. But we see tight money in quite a few places in varied forms. And you can see that in South Korea. South Korea is running a tight money policy. It's got a very flat yield curve. The quantity of money is growing at a reasonable rate relative to growth in GDP growth, but not a high rate. And when you look at the history of South Korea recently, unemployment's not a problem. It's bouncing around at higher numbers than it was a year ago. If you look at GDP growth. It's decelerated a little, but there's actually nothing about GDP data that shows that short-term volatility in GDP numbers is predictive about the future. If you actually look whether it's South Korea or any other major nation, plenty of them have had the downward movement a little, followed by, in fact, South Korea, I think, did that about 18 months ago, where it decelerated and then reaccelerated again. That's pretty normal. For these banks to be raising rates right now, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But the flattening of the yield curve, the big negative for the future is that the flattening of the yield curve will decelerate loan growth. Because, as you know, in every fractional reserve banking system anywhere, wherever it is, the future growth of the quantity of money is, in fact, perfectly parallel to the future growth of the banking system's net increase in loans. And the way a banking system increases the quantity of money is to increase its net outstanding loans. And so this speaks to a slower growth in the quantity of money and a slower growth of lending, and not the big firms and the high quality firms, but the smaller firms get starved out in that environment, which is a bad thing. Whether it's in America or Europe or South Korea or, for that matter, Japan, not necessarily China. China is, its own strange thing.
한국 경제가 괜찮을 거라고 생각하시는 전반적으로?
So, do you think that Korean economy will be okay in general?
Depends what you think okay means.
그러니까 우리는 계속 지금 내년에 경제가 불황이 올 거라고 계속 생각하거든요.
So
South Korea is growing. It's growing slowly. You know that. But South Korea cannot grow at the rates that it used to grow at. It's already too big to grow at the rates that it used to grow at. And it's got, as you know better than I, a very significant export-import trade, primarily with 4 countries. America, Japan, and Hong Kong. And if you look at, and then you move off to the EU. And so if you look at those and you think of that, it's relatively impossible for South Korea to, although South Korea did a marvelous job of doing well in the last downturn, it's very hard for South Korea to escape the global slowdown in the economy. But still, when we look at the rest of the world, and we think about things like the traditional leading economic indexes as depicted by the Conference Board, they're high and rising in America. They're high and rising in all of the EU land, Eurozone. They're a little weak in Britain, and they're going sideways in Japan. So if you think of that, the biggest problems that South Korea has in that regard are South Korea doesn't sell that much to Britain, or really China, and to a lesser extent the sideways quality of Japan. Now I think you can make some arguments that are positive for South Korea and Japan both, relative to what's going on in the world right now, because auto exports are a relatively important thing for both countries. Or at least you could view it as auto exports or auto sales, whether it's a plant in the country or a plant somewhere else making, whether it's Hyundai or Nissan or whatever in Japan. And the self-imposed problems in Germany for the automakers, you're familiar with those. The self-imposed problems of Germany for the automakers will make it easier for the Asian automakers to sell cars into the broader market because the Germans won't. I mean, the Germans are being suicidal right now. What? The Germans are restricting the output of automobiles. The German automakers can't produce cars because of the recently imposed restrictions that the German government has imposed on them in the aftermath of the Volkswagen scandal. And so German auto sales are down, which is the reason German GDP is down. German GDP is, if you take autos out of German GDP, Germany's going along fine, sideways. But when you take the autos out, you see that. If you don't take the autos out, Germany's actually declining in GDP.
그럼 현대자동차 내년에 괜찮은 거예요?
So do you think that Hyundai will be growing up or stable?
Are you talking about the stock or the business? I don't want to comment on the stock.
Business.
And business-wise?
Yeah, I think they have an increased opportunity to sell
Really?
right now. Yeah, increased opportunity to sell because the Germans won't.
I see.
그런 의미에서 지금 넘버 3.
So
And of course, there's also the other potential problem of tariffs with Euroland to America, which doesn't really impact South Korea directly. It impacts South Korea indirectly.
잘 모르겠죠 지금 무슨 말인지.
So
Yeah.
let me make another point, just to. Let me make another point. I'll show you this in a different way. And in fact, you can have this if you want. Well, I gotta find it first. There hasn't been a negative year for the United States stock market since 1939, when it was the third year of the president's term. This looks at the U.S. stock market. You can have this. You can take it with you.
Can I take a book?
You can have it.
No, you can.
I'm giving it to you. I'm headed home tonight anyway, so there's plenty more at home. This looks at presidents, American presidents, in the first year of their term, the second year of their term, the third year of their term, and the fourth year of their term. American presidencies, unlike let's say the European system, you have the 5-year concept with a unicameral parliament, but America has bicameral legislature and a 4-year guaranteed system. Almost all of the negatives are in the first 2 years of the president's term, but the third year of the president's term, the one we're about to start in a few weeks, hasn't actually been negative since 1939. This is the sweet spot where business and politics in America collide, because all material adverse legislation in American politics happens back here. All big legislation in American history, modern American history, happens back here. We don't do big legislation over here. And that's because the president's party, as just happened a few weeks ago, always loses relative power to the opposition party in the midterm elections right then. And when the president party has less power, they can't do as much. And in fact, when you get a gridlocked Congress like we have in America now, I mean, in a lot of ways, you can't do very much in the South Korean legislature because the makeup of the parties is so split. There isn't any real heavy control. But we in America have direct opposition of the upper chamber and the lower chamber, as you know. And therefore, the only things that can get passed are the things everybody agrees on. And therefore, no bad things will happen. The history of that is very clear. It's the reason this occurs. If you remember, 1939 is the beginning of World War II.
얼마만큼 자신하냐?
how much do you confident about these?
I think this is really important because America is 60% of the global stock market. America is also, South Korea has got an interesting position. I don't want to be demeaning to South Korea, but the American economy, of course, is bigger and is the biggest single economy in the world, but it's only 25% of global GDP. South Korea is the, I believe, 11th largest economy in the world, roughly, give or take a little, depending on how you measure it. And there's a fact about South Korea that I don't think most people appreciate. I doubt if most South Koreans appreciate it or understand it. I say appreciate it. Appreciate's a word in American English that has two meanings. I meant understand. I don't mean dislike. America is not only the biggest economy in the world, it's also the most diverse, and it's also got the most diverse stock market. The second most diverse stock market in the world is Japan. The third is Britain, and the fourth is South Korea. South Korea's stock, now here's how you measure that.
How about Hong Kong?
Here's how you measure, no, it's not as diverse. So here's how you measure that. And I can send you data on this if you want it, but when you look at the 5 largest stocks, you ask what percentage of the stock market do they make up? And the smaller the number, the more diverse the stock market is. So when we look at America, its 5 largest stocks make up about 11% of the stock market. If you look at most countries, the 5, like China, the 5 largest stocks make up over half the market.
How much?
Half the word?
Half the money value of the market.
Wow.
Most people don't think this through because most people think mostly about their own country and they don't think about all the other countries. If you look at South Korea,
Samsung.
the 10 largest stocks, thinking this through, I mean, Samsung makes up about 30%.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And then the 10 largest stocks make up about half, not the 5 largest. That's actually very diverse. And they're different industries. So you've got different industries and a smaller percentage of the total money value of the market. South Korean market's pretty diverse. I mean, South Koreans might not think of it that way, but it is, compared to other countries. And therefore, it's also, I mean, if you, I'm not trying to tell you something you know better than I know, but Samsung's diversified. If you look at the LG group, it's diversified. A lot of orientation toward different things in that diversification, and that contributes also to the diversity of the South Korean market. It's a more stable market, and therefore it is more consistent with global trade in some ways. That's the reason why what happened in 2008-9 was so remarkable in South Korea, because otherwise, in a world where import-export is important and to those other major countries, it's hard to envision. It's easy to envision doing better or worse, but not hugely so. And so what's South Korea feeling right now? It's feeling the global slowdown. And it's not, other than the stupidity of the central bank, which South Korea is not unique in, it's not really of its own making. It said differently, in some ways, South Korea is overly sensitive to the slowdown because it's used to a faster growth rate from the past. Same's true in China. Although China's got its own differences. I mean, China's always different. Everything about China is different.
2020년에 글로벌 리세션이 온다는 게 많이 하고 있는 사람들이 미국의 리세션, 리세션, 불황. 그 얘기랑은 반대되는 얘기 하시는 것 같아요.
Many people are assuming that in 2020, 한국이
글로벌.
in globally, they're gonna meet a global recession.
I like that.
What does it mean?
Why do you think like? Yeah.
So think about what happens if many people think that and then it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
What happens?
안 일어나긴 했지 사실.
The thing that moves markets is surprise. So if people expect bad, and you don't get bad, as I said before. If everyone thinks it's going to be bad, but it ends up not being bad, things have to be improved. Sentiment has to rise. Markets have to do well. If people think it's going to be very bad, and it's only a little bad, things will rise. People have never been very good at forecasting these things in the first place. So when they increasingly agree that they're all right, you increasingly get the likelihood that they're wrong. That's your point in your first question about the contrarian part. When there's a high uniformity of opinion about capital markets, the uniformity is almost always wrong. How it's wrong isn't always so clear. But when there's a high uniformity of agreement about what will happen, it's almost always wrong somehow.
근데 본인이 틀릴 수도 있는 거예요.
그 얘기예요. But there are some chances that your opinion or
Of
your
course.
thoughts might be wrong.
Of course.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's always true.
Yeah.
And that's always true for all of us.
Right.
And this is a realm where no one ever knows. You just play odds.
Right.
And you can't know.
Right.
And if you think you know, you're wrong. And you're overconfident. And overconfidence is a killer. But to believe that because people say something will happen in markets that it will, that's a wrong concept. If figuring out what will happen, you might be wrong at. But as a general rule, markets pre-price widely known information and widely agreed conclusions in marketplaces will be wrong. Somehow. Let me give you an example of that going the other way. Everybody thinks it'll be a little bad, but in fact it ends up being very bad. That's an example of going the other way. Something else happens. If they all agree it's going to be a little bad, it might be good, it might be really bad. You can make a conclusion and be completely wrong, but the thing that they've all agreed on doesn't happen. That's what markets do for a living. Markets pre-price widely known information and conclusions.
상대니까 이런 거에 동의를 하지 않는 건지 사람들이 코리안 스톡 마켓에 대해서 루징 인터레스트를 하는데.
So for the question 3, how are you looking at the Korean economy? You already talked about it. And news are spreading fast that foreign investors are losing interest in Korean stock market.
Yep, they'll be back.
They'll be back? Really?
They're like sheep. Somebody tells them the wolves are coming, they run away. When the wolves don't come, they come back. So, I mean, South Korea is a great country. South Korea is one of the, mind you, South Korea is not as big an economy as America. It's not as diverse an economy as America. It's not this, it's not that, it's not the other. But it's a lot of great things. It's one of the greatest countries in the world. They'll be back. They come back to great countries.
진짜 믿어보겠다. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll believe you.
I don't think that, if they get scared away from Myanmar, they don't come back. That was a joke.
We will believe you.
So, let's just say some things about South Korea, just so that we are on the same page here. Koreans work a lot, you know that.
Yeah.
The percentage...
Too much.
Well, what's it? Things like that are a matter of opinion, but things that they work a lot, that's a fact. One person's too much is another person's too little, and beauty's in the eyes of the beholder, and all those things. But the fact of the matter is that more or less half the South Korean populace works. I don't think you can find that in hardly any other countries that are developed countries. You certainly don't find that in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, and the biggest, most diversified economy in the world. A very much smaller percentage of the American population works. And then South Koreans work more hours than Americans work per day or week or year, however you want to measure. There's all this concern that South Koreans have wrongly about government debt, about household debt in South Korea. I just want you to think about this for a second. You can do whatever you want, sure. I just want you to think about this for a second. Every single time, no exceptions, that there's a global crisis, the dollar rises. There's no exceptions to that. Other currencies do whatever they do, but the dollar rises. Why? Because the dollar is the one big high-quality liquid pool that fearful assets can flow into. The dollar always rises in a crisis. So when you think about where does South Korea fall into the scale of things, you want to benchmark against America. And when you think about that fact, household debt as a percent of GDP is lower than in America. Government debt as a percent of GDP is comparable to America. The interest rates, think of your 10-year rate versus the American 10-year rate. You got a lot of cushion there. The world's telling, because the 10-year rate's free set. And the market's telling you what it thinks of South Korea relative to what it thinks of America, which is positive, right? If it was negative, South Korean rates would be higher than American rates.
High?
Yes, if there was more fear of South Korea than there was of America for any reason, South Korean rates would be higher. The fact is, I think South Koreans underappreciate the country.
Underappreciate.
그러니까 자기 좀 낮춰서
Underestimate?
예, underestimate.
In the slowdown that you fear, you're doing better than many European countries.
저평가하는 게 좀 웃긴.
Are you doing quite as well as America is right now? No, America's growing a little faster, but not a lot faster. South Koreans tend to be a little hard on themselves.
아니 한국에서 그렇게 긍정적으로 생각하시니까.
Why do you have such a positive opinions towards Korea?
So South Korea is a mud hole when I was born, with people starving to death,
Right.
and few paved roads, and much more like North Korea is today. And in the aftermath of the 1950s, and forgetting about problems along the way, which many countries have, South Korea is a developed nation, coming from being a mud hole. That's pretty impressive.
But
South Korea is civilized. South Korea is developed. Does South Korea have problems? Every country has problems. If you're looking for a perfect country, you're not going to find it. And the fact is, what do we worry about right now in South? We worry about things like scandal, and we worry about things like corruption. And the reality is, those are pretty normal things to have in a culture that's come from, if you'll pardon the phrase, nowhere fast. I mean, when I was a boy, Ms. Park's father was the head of the country, and he was pretty much of a totalitarian. What do you expect in a place where you had, if you think of when I'm a young man, you're coming right, I'm not a young man anymore, I'm a senior citizen, but when I was a young man, pardon me?
You look young.
I worked very hard to get good genes. And if I'm lucky, I'll live until I'm past 100. And I'm healthy. But when I was in my 20s, South Korea was still this thing that hadn't yet found itself. It's done amazingly well. People typically don't think of that very much. The reason I think about South Korea more than I think about a lot of other places is because of stuff like her. That's one of my granddaughters.
Really?
Half Korean?
Yes.
Oh,
Eurasian.
Oh, we didn't know that.
Yeah.
I have three half Korean grandchildren.
Oh.
And
She's
my wife and I have 3 sons, and one of them married Korean.
Korean American.
Yes.
Wow.
So I paid more attention over the years to South Korea perhaps than to a lot of countries. You want to see pictures of my other grandchildren?
No,
I can show you those
understand.
too.
No wonder why you're so good at understanding
yeah.
Korean economy and society.
So
이런 사실을 많은 사람들이 알고 있나?
Do many people know about this
Yes.
fact?
all of my grandchildren know.
No, I mean a lot of people.
They all speak Korean.
Do you know?
Did you know?
I think I had some knowledge of that.
Oh, really?
But not.
I know my son knows. And she's a very good daughter-in-law. His daughter-in-law's good. You know, these women, I find unthinkable. And the men. I mean, I tried to tell my sons that I could pick their wives for them better than they could, but they wouldn't listen to me. They decided they wanted to pick their own wives. And then these women think they should have say over my grandchildren. How outrageous is that? I mean, with my experience and my prior history raising the men that they love, you'd think that they would turn to me for wisdom, but they don't. They just think they should be able to say what happens to my grandchildren. It's just outrageous.
아니, 물어봐도 되나? 며느리가 그런다는 거야, 그렇지? 에이, 나중에 물어보자. Number 4 맞아, number 4.
좋아하신 것 같아요. So move on to number 4. Have you come up with a very variety of
PSR.
Yeah, I know what all that says. So I don't think that in today's era, the price research ratio works anymore. And I can explain why if you want, but I don't think it does. The price sales ratio works, but it works differently than it used to work. When I developed a price sales ratio, computer power was expensive and scarce, typically associated with mainframe computers. And it was a concept that no one had in their brain. And if you just screen for low price sales ratio companies, you tend to do better than the market. Today, everybody's got computers. Computing is very dispersed. I can get price sales ratios on a mobile phone. The impact of that is that they don't have the power they used to have. What they do is when value stocks do better than growth, price sales ratio does better than value as a whole, low price sales ratio. When growth does better than value, high price sales ratio stocks do better.
Yeah.
So it's
That's
not
your theory.
it's not something that works all the time anymore. It's like a levered function on growth versus value. When value works, low price sales works very well. When growth works, you want high price sales. When I was first doing that, you just wanted low price sales all the time because nobody understood what low price sales was. Today it doesn't work like that. And of course, South Korea has a slight value tilt as a country, whereas America has a slight growth tilt as a country. America's slight growth tilt is because of the big tech stocks and the big pharma. South Korea doesn't. South Korea's technology isn't the kind of technology like Facebook or Google. It's more like Intel, and and you don't have the big pharma, and those two bring up the growth stock quality of America relative to South Korea.
내가 궁금한 건 이 세일즈는 데이터가 많은데 리서치에 대한 데이터는 별로 없을 거 생각을 보거든요. 왜냐면 연구 개발비가 얼마나 되는지 잘 모르는데 그것도 데이터가 다 있는 거죠.
그러니까 세일즈는 있는데 이거에 대한 데이터는 많이 확보가 되어 있는.
그러니까 우리는 잘 모르고.
So we understand that price to sell data has there is a lot of data based on this, but we're curious if there's a lot of data related to price to research ratio.
No, but it doesn't work. regardless, because today's world is twisted by all of these things that don't require much research. In that, if you go back to a world of the kind of world that's Intel or Samsung or Taiwan Semiconductor, you have to do the research to do the new products, to make the sales and to make the profits. But if you're Google or Facebook or if you're Uber, this is just code writing, and there's not a lot of research to it. And the world has gotten morphed by this part of technology that has pushed off the market caps tied to simple code writing. And so it doesn't really work that way in research anymore, because so much can be done that actually does really, really, really well based off of an idea in code writing, as opposed to what used to be a world that required research to succeed.
그럼 그 아까 지금 페이스북이나 구글이나 평가를 딱한 것도 지금 그렇게 안 좋게 하시는 거죠?
So,
21번 질문이었어요.
we have another question that related to what you said.
Okay?
IT companies such as Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Google, their stock price have risen quite a lot compared to the traditional companies like GM or Walmart. What are your thoughts regards this? I don't think.
So if you think of a normal stock market cycle, it kind of looks like this. Bear market, bull market, next bear market. In an overly simple sense, it kind of works like this. This is the middle, this is the first third, this is the back third, right? In that regard, here, the stocks that work best are the ones that are the small and the value-ish. Low price sales, low PE, low price to book, low price to cash flow, low price to EBITDA, all those things. Over here, the ones that do the best are the exact reverse. Biggest, high quality, and growthy. Growthy meaning gee-whizzy. High quality and gee-whizzy, so that the last people to get into a bull market can buy something where in their mind they feel like they can see forever with it. Right? Amazon is forever taking over retailing. The middle is a transition phase that's much more unpredictable. It's like a big question mark. Someplace between the first third and the back third, this transitions and the leadership changes. But normally in the last phase of the bull market, those kinds of stocks do best. The big and the high quality with growth attributes. The more they have all three of those, the more they do well and the higher the valuations go. This is exactly parallel to what I said to you before, where I said this is where you want low PSR, and this is where you want high PSR. Because the high PSR is perfectly parallel to the way you put the question. The high PSR of Amazon, the high PSR of Facebook, the high PSR, it fits right perfectly.
So are you expecting to be like falling down, like fall?
Not until there.
Okay.
Until the end of the bull market, which I believe is still a ways to go tied to this and other things. I believe this has another leg. Typically, big, high quality leads until the end of a bull market. Then in the bear market, it transitions, and then these lead. If you think of the low end of the market in quality and in size, it typically bounces off the bottom of a bear market the most. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We have, how much time do we have?
I don't know, I've been paying attention to
It's 3:30 right now.
Yeah, so-
And
Do you need more time? It's fine if you need more time.
Okay.
we have the room until 4 o'clock, and we can always find a new room if
Okay.
we're getting kicked out.
Okay. 4시까지 끝낸다고.
I don't have to be anywhere until 5. I got plenty of time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've got someplace I have to be at 5.
질문이 별로 없다고 해주세요.
그 얘기. We have a few questions left.
Sure, go ahead.
personal 퀘스천 해도 되냐고.
Can we ask some personal questions, if you don't mind?
Depends what they are.
Okay.
네.
I expect to keep my clothes on.
Sure. So number 7, what kind of investment lesson did you get from your father? Your father was famous for buy and hold. He named Motorola as a representative item, but the company ended up struggling afterwards. So.
Which literally I was kind of glad he never lived to see. So, he owned Motorola from the early 1950s. He bought Motorola in 1952, and he owned it for a really long time. And what my father was really exceptional at, and what he taught me the most, is how to analyze businesses. He was above and beyond all things an analyst of businesses. He lived in a world, however, that was not really the world that I evolved in. He lived in a world of pens and papers and hand crank adding machines and non-electric typewriters, and as opposed to this, and or this, and those kinds of things are ones. If you think of today's world, where we have the ability to have information quite readily about trends on things all over the world, to be able to look at stock prices and data all over the world, to be able to use data readily. Those are the kinds of things that when he was young and in his formative stages, he never could have even conceived of, because it was decades before any of that would ever begin to happen. When I was young, very young, everything was a mainframe computer, and if you had an idea, you had to fill out the punch cards and give them to someone who ran them through the mainframe computer. You couldn't actually operate something yourself. And when you could first start to do that with the introduction of PCs, but not mini computers, suddenly a person could get an idea and play a what-if game and try to be creative. Those worlds were all before my father's time. Those worlds were all after my father's time. And so the kinds of things that I'm talking to you about stuff like this, he would have never thought about stuff like that. He wouldn't have even tried to. And what he did is tried to find really good things that he was pretty darn sure were really good things, keep paying attention to them based on products, the research that they did, what the management was like, what the culture of the company was like, what the basic attributes of the company were relative to competition, and he always thought relative to competition. And so he taught me to do that. And that's actually very valuable. You've got another question in here someplace about that I saw on gross margins. And he's the one that taught me the power of gross margins. I mean, the reality is, usually, you'd asked one of your earlier questions relative to the market, and you cited Amazon and then you said General Motors. And General Motors had fat gross margins, and they used to have dominant market share. And they squandered that position because when you've got fat gross margins, you can either, if you know what to do with it, use it to beat up on your competition and get better and bigger in all ways, or if you're a stupid management, you can take like easy and squander it, which is what General Motors did for decades. And I mean, General Motors already been doing that by the time I'm an adult. One of the best things that ever happened to General Motors was World War II decimating Europe and decimating their auto industry. And one of the worst things that ever happened to General Motors is when the European auto industry caught up, and then the Japanese auto industry came along. The American auto industry hadn't changed and wasn't ready for any of that. And General Motors was sitting there like a cow milking a fat gross margin. But a fat gross margin is a wonderful thing because in a downturn, the company with the fat gross margin can underprice their competition and drive their other competition out of business. The company with a fat gross margin can outspend others on research and creativity and testing things and taking chances on things. And if it's a capable management, they'll use that fat gross margin as a tool. And that's, it's part of the business analyst part that my father taught me. My father was a very strange man. I don't know that you do or don't know this. I've written about this, but in a world before Asperger's syndrome was understood, my father was an Asperger's person.
Really?
Yes, really, absolutely. He had all of the archetypal features of an Asperger person. He was just stereotype. If he was sitting here talking to you, he'd be doing this. He would pace a room corner to corner. He could give a lecture, or he could sit in a lecture hall and listen to a lecture. But if there was a cocktail party after the event was over, he was hiding in the corner because he couldn't talk to people. And he always operated by himself. And the only people pretty much that he ever really tolerated on any ongoing basis were me and my oldest brother, and my oldest brother couldn't take it for very long. I was the youngest, so I watched him with people with Asperger's say things that sound cruel, but they have no intention for them to be cruel. And they don't even understand that you're reacting badly to it, and when you react badly to it, they don't understand why. And when I was a little boy, I would watch him with my older brothers and my mother, and I would figure, he doesn't mean any of that stuff. I didn't know why he didn't mean any of that stuff, but I knew he didn't, so I didn't take it personally, whereas they did. And my oldest brother, worked with my father for a couple of years and ultimately left to become a professor because he couldn't take it.
그래도 어쨌든 아버님 존경하시는 거죠.
But however, you still respect your father.
My father was great. He was just different. He was unusual. If you had a bell curve of normal qualities, he'd be out over here somewhere. He wasn't normal. This would be normal, right? He wasn't a normal kind of person.
How about you?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a normal person, but I'm not abnormal like he was. And I certainly don't have Asperger's.
Number 8.
Is
I
there,
don't know, number 9.
who is your mentor in your life?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it is your father. Is there anyone else?
I've had a bunch of mentors, different ones in different ways. So, my father was certainly a very important mentor, but I will point out that it's pretty common for a father to be a mentor. It's also pretty common for a mother to be a mentor, although my mother was not so much my mentor. In a lot of ways, my wife has been my mentor. My wife and I have been together since I was 17 years old. And so she, in some ways, almost raised me. 17 is pretty young. We've literally been married now 48 years. And she hasn't thrown me out yet. Although, I run for re-election every year. That other is, I was mentored very heavily by a guy named Jim Michaels, who within journalism is legendary. He was for 38 years the editor of Forbes magazine.
What?
Forbes magazine.
Forbes.
He was the editor of Forbes magazine. He was largely sort of behind the scenes in most things because Malcolm Forbes was a bigger than life personality. But if you think of journalism in days of old, you had the advertising side. You had the editorial side, and then you had everything else, all the support stuff, whether it's accounting or all the what you could view as glue that holds the business together, and it ran like a tripod. And Michaels ran everything that was editorial for 38 years. He's the guy that made Forbes magazine what it was, and he retired in the year 2000. But he adopted me personally into Forbes. He edited me personally in Forbes. He did, most journalism is based on a two-step edit. He did a one-step edit with me. He edited me personally. He taught me how to write. And in teaching me how to write, he also taught me a lot about thinking. And he put a lot of ideas in my head. He was a great thinker. He was a funny man. When I say funny, I don't mean humorous. He was little. He had these terribly arthritic hands, sparkly eyes, his brain's moving a mile a minute all the time. And because he was so short, sitting at his desk, he looked a little bit sometimes like a chipmunk sitting in front of his desk, but his mind's moving a mile a minute. And he's this little guy. And when I was younger, I don't believe in consuming alcohol. Alcohol's a young man's game. And when I was young, I consumed alcohol, but I decided that it was better for me all the way around if I don't drink alcohol, so I haven't in a long time. But I used to drink alcohol with Michaels. And here's this little tiny guy. And this guy could pound down vodka martinis into the middle of the night like nobody's business. It's this little tiny body, and I could never understand how he could put that much liquor into his body and not have it, make him go horizontal or something. He was just this amazing little dynamo, real high energy, but little. And he put lots of ideas in my head, so he was another major mentor for me.
Is he still alive?
Oh, no. Jim died about 11 years ago. And but after he stepped down as editor of Forbes, he and his wife and Sherry and I would travel together. And I don't travel much, but Michaels was just a great guy. If you could look Michaels up on Google, and there's a whole little cult of people that are Michaels mentees.
Wow.
And they're scattered throughout, almost all of them have something to do with writing, but they're scattered around in relatively important places. Some of them are now getting to the point of retirement, or they are retired, but he had a big impact on a lot of people.
Let's go to number 11. You have donating.
Have you been making donations?
No, I'm not a big believer in charity.
Really?
The biggest thing you can do is create jobs. So let me describe that to you. People don't think this through. I don't think people think correctly about this. I might be thinking wrong, but what difference does it make? I think the way I think. So, in capitalism, if you understand the capital markets pricing mechanism correctly, you know that what the capital markets are asset allocators. And money doesn't really much sit still. This kind of green stuff is really a paper representation of something in a bank. And when I put money in a bank, it gets lent out to somebody who has a use for it. And if I buy a stock, I get a piece of paper that says I have a fractional ownership of a business. And somebody gets the money that I gave them, which they do something with, or they put in a bank, which gets lent out, which someone does something with. Capital markets allocate resources as efficiently as they can be done. One must presume that Jeff Bezos somehow had a good combination of knowledge, vision, skill, and luck to be able to do the allocations that created Amazon. And of course, lots of people like Amazon, don't they now? At the same time, and in the same way, there's some little business that's doing the same thing, creating some little product that helps people, and the marketplace is doing this all the time. Do we know what the next new things will be that people create? No, we don't. But we didn't know that Amazon would come along either, and we didn't know before that Microsoft would, and once upon a time we didn't know that Samsung would exist. Capital markets allocate as efficiently as it can be allocated. So anything that pulls money away from that actually suboptimizes asset allocation, and therefore is not good for humans. People like donations because they see that it helps this thing. But in the concept in economics known as the basket principle, they don't understand what you don't see over here, that's robbing. By putting the resources here, you don't see the better thing that would happen over here that would happen if you let the resources get allocated through the capital markets to wherever they should best go. And so charitable contributions almost always suboptimize. The only way charity doesn't necessarily suboptimize and therefore isn't bad for humanity, it makes people feel good about themselves. I gave. Very Christian concept. South Korea has almost as many Christians as a percentage of the population as America does, which isn't particularly a laudatory statement about America. But unless I think I know as much about that stuff as I do about what I'm supposed to in the private sector, if I allocate charity toward it, I'm suboptimizing, and therefore I'm not actually helping. I may feel good about it, but I'm not actually helping, and I shouldn't feel good about it. Charity usually is a negative for humanity. And the only time that it isn't is if the donation that you give, you actually know so much about that area that you can allocate those resources as effectively as if you were doing it in your own specialty in the private sector. As if I was borrowing money from a bank to deploy into my business. Right? Growing jobs. So I'd rather just grow jobs. Growing jobs is one of the best things you can do.
That's unique.
You asked if I'm relatively normal. I'm not actually relatively normal. I think a lot of weird thoughts.
정확하게 도네이션이 너무 그런 건 아니라고 하는 거지.
도네이션에 대해서 믿지 않는 거죠. 이게 뭐 크리스천이라고 생각을 하고 여기는 그쪽이 아니고 약간 부정적으로 생각하는 것 같긴.
도네이션 많이 했는데.
그래요? 뭐라고?
그러니까 우리가 물어본 거는 도네이션을 많이 하셨는데 왜 이렇게 많이 하냐 이거였거든.
아 그래요? 근데 여기 읽기도 전에 갑자기 얘기를 하셔가지고 다시 물어봐요. We found some of the parts that you have donated a lot. And
Only a few things.
including Johns Hopkins.
Trees and Johns Hopkins.
Yeah. And
That's about it.
That's all?
Yeah.
Oh really?
Really?
But I know a lot about trees.
위키피디아 보면 되게 많이 한다.
Oh, when we look at Wikipedia, there's a lot of information related to donation.
Trees and Johns Hopkins.
Oh,
So I know a lot about trees. And I'm basically the prime funder of Western tree science. And I'm very active in that. And I know a lot about how that has to evolve to be productive. And the Hopkins part is because, so Johns Hopkins, it was to the medical school, not to Johns Hopkins in general. And my grandfather, who was also a temporary form of a mentor, I was his favorite grandchild, and I thought he hung the moon. And I was very close to him until he died. My grandfather, but he died when I was young. My grandfather was in the 4th graduating class of Johns Hopkins Medical School. He went to Johns Hopkins before they'd ever graduated anybody. Johns Hopkins became the top medical school in America, and for a long time, Johns Hopkins was the top medical complex in America, including the hospital being the top hospital in America. And he was part of that original birth. And that donation is largely just as a tribute to my grandfather.
할아버지를 위해서.
Harabati. Yeah, exactly.
Does your grandchild tell you?
Do they call me that? No, they call me Jipa.
Oh, Jipa, what's Jipa?
That's just a name that's made up. Jipa. It doesn't mean anything. They just call me Jipa. They don't call me Harabati.
Oh,
no,
really?
They don't.
No.
뭐야
Like grandpa is a G. Another question is, why did you decide to become an investor like your father? Are you naturally following your family legacy? What kind of event triggered your interests? Your son Nathan is also following the same path. Did you recommend him, or is it his own choice?
This is America. It's always his own choice.
True.
So, in my case, it's kind of none of those. I was going to go to graduate school, and I don't know about nowadays, but in those days in America, if you got accepted to a good graduate school and you wanted a one-year deferral, they always would give you a one-year deferral. And so I got accepted to the University of Chicago to go to graduate school. And my father came to me and said, look, you can get a one-year deferral. Why don't you come to work for me? Your older brother's working for me. Why don't you come to work for me? And if you don't like it, you go back to graduate school next year. And I said, okay, why not? I was a young kid, right? And I liked parts of school a lot. I liked learning about the things I was interested in. I didn't like learning about the things that they made you learn that I wasn't interested in. So I kind of said, okay, I'll see that. And then so I went there. I worked for him for a year. I liked everything about investing. I knew because of the way he was, and the word Asperger's hadn't yet been created, that either I was going to kill him or he was going to kill me, one or the other, without meaning to. Does that make sense? And that wasn't healthy for me to work for him. So I quit, and then I said, but I don't think I want to go back to graduate school either. I like this stuff. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this. And so for about 10 years, and I actually described this in my 10 Roads to Riches book, for about 10 years, I did a little this and a little that, and kind of staggered around trying all kinds of ways as a sole proprietor, entrepreneur, trying to make a living, learning this, learning that, learning by doing before my career ever really started to take off. And in some ways, it could have gone lots of different directions. I mean, when I was young, I did construction work, I cut the end of my finger off, did a lot of, my first house with my wife is something I built with my hands, which was actually primitive, but it kept the rain off. Early on, I was trying to find a way to make a living in finance, and I also early on supplemented doing some construction work because I could do construction work, because construction work's easy entry and it's not that hard to learn. And it really took my real graduate school was those 10 years. I did a little bit of merchant banking, I did a little bit of consulting, I did a little bit of investment advice that wasn't money management, I did a little of this, did a little of that, I did customized research projects in San Francisco. I did a lot of different stuff.
그럼 마지막 12번 질문 10분 두 개만 더.
Do you have any dreams you want to achieve for the rest of your life?
Well, I got a couple things I want to do.
What are those?
I'm doing some of them. I'll tell you a story that you could help me with in Seoul. So in 1982, I started writing, and not very well, for a thing that doesn't exist anymore called the San Jose Business Journal in San Jose, California. And then 2 years later, I got adopted by Jim Michaels to write for Forbes. And I wrote for Forbes for 32 and a half years. And meanwhile, I started writing for Financial Times in Britain. And in London.
Wow.
And
Financial Times.
yes, I've written there for 8 years.
8 years?
8 years, monthly. And then Forbes got sold to a Hong Kong private equity firm, and they have a different plan, and they eliminated all their columnists. They have online columns, but not in print. And every place print and online exists, print's the gold standard. That the best stuff goes in print, but there's a lot more that goes online. And so I didn't want to be someplace that had print and online if I wasn't going to be in print. So I looked around and started writing for USA Today, where I write now. And then I got this crazy idea, which is as crazy as my ideas about charity. And my idea was to write in other European countries that weren't in English. So at this point in time, and I got some samples I can leave you. At this point in time, my columns run in 15 Western European countries. Every every Western European country except for Portugal, Greece, Ireland, and the Flemish part of Belgium. But every other Western European country. 3 of them I only am adopted in this month in January. Finland and Luxembourg start in January. But I'm the first columnist in Italy's history that isn't Italian. I'm the first columnist in Denmark's history that isn't Danish, the first in Sweden that isn't a Swede, the first in the Netherlands that's not Dutch, the first in Austria that's not Austrian, the third in Switzerland. There's multiple columnists that have been from other countries, in Britain, of course, and also in Germany, and a little bit in France. I'm the first columnist in Spain that isn't Spanish. In all of them, they're all European, of course, and except for the Financial Times, which is a little bit different. In all of them, I take a topic that's either pan-European or global, and the column is 80 to 85% similar to something that'll run in other countries, but then 15 to 20% customized through my firm's research department directly to that country, so the reader reads it as if it's written directly to them. And then we have internal people in every one of those countries, and then we have external translators, and we get them reconciled on the translation, and I submit in native language. So my columns run monthly in Dagens Industri, the largest newspaper in Sweden, in Borsen, the third largest newspaper and the most respected in Denmark, Sole 24 Ore, the third largest and most respected in Italy, the business newspaper of Italy. In Handelsblatt in Germany, the largest business newspaper. Handelszeitung in Switzerland, the largest business newspaper. And so then once I started doing that, my columns right now run in more countries than any columnist in history ever has. And then I got this idea. So if you're in something like Helsingin Sanomat in Finland, where I started in January, there's 500,000 page circulation, which is really big for Finland. It's a really strong newspaper for that country, because the country's not that big. The country's got 5 million people. They get 1 out of 10 people in the country delivered in print in their home. That's amazing penetration if you think about it. But then when you think of South Korea, when you think of Japan, I mean, you just look at Asahi Daily in Japan, 8 million daily circulation.
Yeah, right.
Huge compared to anything in America. I mean, the 3 biggest in America are USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times, and Asahi Daily is bigger than all of them put together, right? By a good notch. You people are about as big. You people would be as big as the biggest.
Yeah, right.
So it dawned on me right now, I can say very simply, as a fact, that not only am I the first columnist in a lot of countries that isn't from that country, but I'm also have my columns running in more countries in more countries than any other columnist in history of any type has. So then I got this other crazy guy that stepped down as CEO 2.5 years ago, and all this kind of came together in time, and I got this crazy idea that says, so if this year I got the idea that if I'm already running in more countries than anybody else, if I could get columns running, let's say, in Japan and maybe with you people, then I would be able to say not only that my columns are in more countries, but also in more total volume than anybody in history. And that's a crazy dream.
What, do you have any reasons to have those dreams?
Because I'm crazy.
Other
because
than
it's
crazy,
fun. And because I impact more people that way.
기자가 되려고 하셨던 거 아니에요?
So for example, here's just samples of columns, which I can leave with you that you can take back with you. But, I mean, here's copies of what I do in USA Today, and here's what I do in the Financial Times, and those are in 2 different versions of English, but this is Danish in Denmark, and Swedish in Sweden, Dutch in the Netherlands, Spanish in El Economista in Spain, and Italian in El Sole 24 Ore, and German, and Swiss, which is a slightly different
All
German.
different languages.
All submitted in native language.
Yeah.
None submitted in English.
Yeah.
Always submitted in native language.
Wow.
Austria, Norway, and then most recently France.
Wow.
Uh,
Huge.
And so what I'd like to do next year, when we don't have a bad storm that allows the airplanes to actually land, is what I wanted to talk to you about when I was going to come to Seoul before, and perhaps Mr. Kim, on the possibility of doing some test columns for you. Because what I believe and what I've said to not all of these, but to some of these people when I started, is to say to them, if we did a few test columns and online they clicked well and they were well received by people you respect, then you'd want me to keep going.
원고료가 얼마 안 된다고 얘기했어요. 원고료가.
But it won't be a lot of money. It won't make a lot of money as you
I'm not.
think.
I don't want money. I'm one of the richest people in the world. I don't need money. I don't need money.
라이팅에서 원고료를 주적인 드린다고 우리도.
I do all of these for free.
공짜로 다 하는 거.
I do all these for free.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
A, because it's fun.
Yeah.
B, because I'm doing something no one's ever done before. And doing something no one's ever done before is the most important thing in life you can do, as long as it's a good thing.
We can pay.
I don't need money. 3, I spread influence and I teach people to think the way I think. Every one of these columns, of course, South Korea would be very different than Europe, because all the ones in Europe have European things associated with them. But every column basically does some version of this. Everybody thinks this works like this. It doesn't. It really works like that. Here's how you know that's true, and here's what you can do with that here in your country. And so the 15 to 20% of each of these is customized directly to that country through our research department that covers every country in the world. And then the roughly 80 to 85% is something for these that's either global or pan-European. In what I would do if it was allowed for you would be to cover something that was either global or Asian or South Korean. But for example, could be something about US-South Korea trade, right?
Okay. Wow.
So that's what I wanted to talk to you about when I was coming before, when the storm would let me land. And
China.
and well, literally I went right over Seoul because I could get to Japan.
Do you have a plan to come back to Seoul?
Yes, probably March.
March. Okay.
But
원고는 언제 주실 거냐고.
When are you going to give us your script?
I'd want to make sure that I was planning to come and talk to you specifically about this. Are you wanting a test column?
Yeah.
Well, I let me say this.
Okay.
Let me say this. To me, this is an important thing to do. And therefore I want it to work well. I don't want it to work badly.
Okay.
And it's better if it's to be done that the test is to test 3. Because if you just do 1, it could be, what you want to do is see how the average of 3 of them do. Because if you just do 1 and there's a bad news cycle, something like what just happened with, like you take today.
Yeah.
Today is the 5th of December. I scheduled to be here quite a while back, as I think you probably know. I, of course, would have had no way to know that President George Herbert Walker Bush would die, but half of my appointments today canceled because of the president's death. If you get something like that in a news cycle, it could impact the results. So the test should really be for 3. If you do 3 and then you average the results of the 3, then you have a pretty good idea what would happen if I did more of those. If you just do 1, it could either be too good or too bad, tied to things that don't really reflect the true pull of the column. So if you wanted to have me do 3, that would be fine, but I don't think it's a good idea to just do 1.
So we'll discuss in Seoul and get back to you as soon as possible for the response.
언제든지 보내주시면 받을 텐데.
But we're always open to have your script so that we could see.
본인이 원하기만 하면.
If you want, we're always open.
네.
So there's another idea that I'd like to talk to you about in Seoul sometime that's half-baked.
Half-baked.
Well, you know, you bake a pie, and a pie that's half-baked isn't ready to eat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
얼마나 더 쓸지.
How long do we have?
As long as you need.
Okay. 대충.
I think we're okay here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I told you before, I think print's important. And I also told you that I've written for the Financial Times for a long time. And I know the Chief Executive Officer of the Financial Times. And he wrote a piece in January of 2017, right after I was, literally the month that my Forbes column ended because of the new owners. And it was about why he thought print was important for the future of newspapers. And I liked what he wrote, and I was, by happenstance, in London the next month. And I sat down with him, and we talked about his column that he wrote about why the print was important. And we got this idea to create a conference. You know, the Financial Times does conferences. And we got this idea to do this conference that we ran last March on the future of news.
Wow.
And
That's very important.
in it, I interviewed him. I don't know if I can see this upside down with my glasses on. I interviewed him on, let me turn this around right side up to print small for an old man like me. I interviewed him on print, or what we call the power of tangibility in an intangible world. And I did one other interview, and I sponsored that. I was the lead sponsor in that conference. And then the idea that John and I had at the time was that if that worked well, we do another conference. We try to do another conference in Europe on the same thing. And so we did that actually last week in Brussels, where we repeated that same interview with John, which is right, no, this is me doing a panel with other people, and then we did the one with John over here, the same one. This is me doing a panel of 3 different successful growing papers in a tough world in 3 different countries and why they're successful. And so that worked better than we feared. So we're going to repeat this one next June in New York, and then we'll repeat this one probably in Paris next year. And now we're starting to talk, and this is why it's half-baked, we're starting to talk about wanting to create one for Asia. Now, here's part of my problem. The Financial Times is owned by Nikkei. And I and the Financial Times believe that there's enough natural, it's harder for people to move around, and there's enough natural hostility to things Japanese that you can't do it in Tokyo. People won't come. And I'd like to try to get some other interest involved early on in an Asian conference, because I think that will help offset the Japanese factor. And so I'd also like to come to Seoul sometime early in the year and talk about a Future of News Asia conference with as a variation of this with the FT, and put through ideas, talk about ideas about how to make that work well. Because once you do one, it'll take a life of its own and more will happen. And it's actually a very important thing to do. Because generally, how do I say this best? I say this best by saying America's had challenges in journalism.
Yeah.
It's been a very tough, competitive world.
Yeah, yeah.
A little bit less so, but the same in Europe. Asian media is just bigger in circulation, in volume.
Just circulation.
Pardon me?
Just circulation.
But by a lot. And so therefore it should be an important topic. So that's a topic I'd like to come and talk about also sometime in 2019, about how's the best way to create a Future of News conference for Asia with the Financial Times. Because again, you know, I'm the prime sponsor of this, just as I was the prime sponsor of that. And so I'd like to talk about that sometime in Seoul as well.
Okay. 공부 쓰겠다는 거 안 쓰겠다는 거 얘기야.
그런 말은 안
알았어요. 우리 저기 5월에 우리 회사 또 컨퍼런스 하는데 혹시 초청하면 오시겠어요?
And you people are
Asian
the
Leadership Conference.
you people are the ideal people to talk to on that in South Korea.
So on 2019 May, we have an Asian Leader Conference. If we invite you, do you have any time or mind to come to visit us?
Well, I was hoping to come to Seoul before then, but I can come back. When in May is it, do you know? I mean, the answer is May is a wide open month, but I'd have to look and see if I've got any conflict.
Late May?
Late May?
Yeah,
Probably.
yeah, maybe at the end of the month.
초청장 보내도 돼.
The last 2 weeks of May are wide open for me right now.
Okay, wow.
Okay.
So I can do that, yeah.
Yeah, we'll send you the invitation so that you can look at the details.
Great.
Okay.
That'd be great. I'd love to do that.
그러면 마지막으로 이 가방.
무슨 가방
가방 언제부터 사게 되냐고.
It's a last question and a personal question. We're very curious about this bag. It's very old and antique. And when did you?
So am I.
When did you start bringing with you?
I don't know. You know, I know when I married my wife, but I don't know when I got the briefcase. I've had the briefcase for a long time.
왜 세 번도 안 바꿔?
I know that this was when Steve Forbes ran for president. It was 1996. And so I know I've had it since 1996. But I'll tell you a funny story about it. My half South Korean daughter-in-law took it from me one Thanksgiving.
Can I take a photo?
Took it from me. She did what she called, like when they have what do they call it? When you have a intervention, that's the American word. When somebody's like got a problem, like they're a drug addict or they've got a gambling addiction or something like that, sometimes the family comes in and does what's called an intervention. And she said she was doing an intervention, and she took the briefcase from me, and she took it to a leather guy and fixed it up. because it was much more beat up before. It fell apart in Heathrow Airport one time, and I put it back together in, you know what duct tape is?
Yeah.
So in Britain they don't call it duct tape, they call it gaffer tape. But I went to a store where they sold gaffer tape, and I taped it back together with gaffer tape and went on, and because duct tape will hold anything together. And then I just left the duct tape on it, and then she did an intervention and took the briefcase away from me, and that was now, you know, probably 8 years ago, something like that. And but it's old, it works, it's good. Well, I don't know why I'd get a new one. My wife's old, she works, she's good. I don't know why I'd get a new one. Same thing. I asked my wife if I should get a new one, and she said no, so that's good.
Thank you for being interviewed with us.
Thank you for your
we really
interest, and
appreciate your time.
I look forward to seeing you in Seoul.
Yeah.
Yeah, we.
She's not.
No, I assume you're in New York.
I live in New Jersey, so
It's probably hard to live in New York,
it is.
unless you live with 17 people in a shoebox.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and again, I apologize for being late.
No. Thank you for being late.